Evening. Welcome to another Zion's Banner broadcast. You will be seeing these. They're being studio worked and they're going to go ahead and be posted. So be ready to tune into our site at www.zionsbanner.org. You can find out more about what we're doing. This is just one part of a larger ministry. Now, one of the things that you will see, and I will actually be back in Phoenix when you probably get a gander at this video, is something you would never see happening if I was back in Phoenix outside, and that's me wearing a jacket. I'm reminiscent of a certain president that had fireside chats, and this is really one of our seaside teachings. We've been doing a few things here that will be organized into, or that fit into series. We're going to be back in Matthew. Originally this message was given at Tree of Life Messianic Congregation, but was never really taped or recorded. So this is an opportunity to record the unrecorded material that's been taught in times past. And being that I'm wearing a jacket, which is unheard of back in Phoenix, this message really is usually the type of message that you would hear given at Advent time. But the temperature drop is enough that I almost feel like I am at Advent time compared to Phoenix. We're going to be asking the question tonight, how many Gentile women does it take to make a Messiah? And we're going to be looking at the genealogy in Matthew. Now, these genealogies are there for a purpose. And so often it's easy to ignore these genealogies. Since this was originally done as a message, and my old preaching teacher said you needed a take-home truth, let me give you a take-home truth. You don't have to be Jewish since Jesus represents Jews and Gentiles. And we're going to see that from looking at this genealogy. The sea breeze is absolutely gorgeous, but it does tend to turn the pages of the Gospel of Matthew a little quicker than I intend. There's a bit of a tension between exclusivism and universality in Jewish thought. Now, let me tell you what that means. How are we unique, and how do other people fit in? We kind of touched on this in other areas, but what did Jewish people think of the nations around them? How were they different? Could those other nations have a relationship with God, and how did that relationship work? And you see a real tension in Jewish thought over this issue. And so let me talk a little bit about that tension. There were proselytes, that's a fancy term for individuals that identified with Israel's God, but were not ethnically Jewish. One of the sources that's really good is kind of a summary with some Talmud quotes in it. That's kind of a nice book as far as reference is Every Man's Talmud. Now there are other references out there, and that's not necessarily like going to the primary sources, but still incredibly useful. And if you went to page 62, you would find this quote in relation to other nations and the fact that they could indeed have relationship, or individuals from them could have relationship with God. Kran says, the finest expression of this thought is found in the exposition of the verse, "Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and ordinances, for if a man do, he shall live by them." And that's a quote from Leviticus 17:5, whereas it is deduced that even a Gentile who obeys Torah is equal to a high priest. Now what that means clearly is that's an inclusive sort of verse that would say that yes, those from the nations can end up relating to God and can end up identifying with His program. I'm not going to say that that works out the same throughout all history, or that the rabbis understood the mechanism for doing that completely, and that there weren't different ways to look at that, because there was something called the Noahide laws that developed, and the idea that nations did receive some commands from God through Noah. But what this does show is that there's evidence that those who wanted to identify with Israel's God and Israel were indeed welcome. Now that's the positive. Here's another great quote, and I've actually ended up doing a message on this. This period of time's coming up, the Feast of Tabernacles, which is on the horizon as far as the Jewish calendar. This quote really kind of was interesting to me in terms of the book of of Noah and understanding how God could accept the repentance of Nineveh without the sacrificial system. And this is kind of relates to an objection sometimes raised that since Nineveh's repentance was accepted, that the shedding of blood isn't really needed. And I'm not going to go into that message. But in Sukkot 53b, on the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles, 70 bullocks were offered on behalf of the 70 nations. Woe to the people of the world who have lost, but they know not what they have lost. And the reference there is the idea that when Rome destroyed the temple, Rome actually lost a mechanism by which the nations were represented, or atonement was provided for the nations. Now, I don't necessarily think that that was the ultimate atonement provided for the nations, but it's an interesting thought, and you can see there that the idea that the nations are in a sense welcomed, not fully, but that God has an interest in the nations is displayed there. Now let me show you some evidence in things that would indicate that proselytes weren't so welcome. There's a quote that a Gentile occupies himself with the study of Torah is deserving of death. It is written, Moses commanded us a Torah, an inheritance for the assembly of Israel. This is very interesting in light of my dissertation in the One Law movement, because there's Jewish thought that the Torah was exclusively the possession of Israel. By Torah, I mean the 5 books of Moses. And that it was Israel's sort of theocratic constitution and instruction. And that's terribly interesting. So now let's start talking about the genealogy. You're going to find that at the beginning of Matthew. The genealogy begins the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now we could say Yeshua HaMashiach. That would be the Hebrew, son of David, son of Abraham. Now you're getting the summary statement at the beginning. Think of it as the headlines. And the genealogy is there, one of the key purposes of the genealogy, is a better way to put it, to be a little bit more precise, is to indicate that Jesus is indeed a son of Abraham and a son of David. Matthew is written to a Jewish audience. The idea is that Jesus is the Messianic king, and so the pedigree of the king is terribly important. Is he someone that can ascend to the Davidic throne, and is he someone who can fulfill the promises that Messiah is supposed to fulfill? And that's the background of Matthew. That's where Matthew fits in the discussion. The different Gospels are not contradictory. They're different accounts with different emphases. So where Matthew begins with the genealogy, Mark doesn't care about the genealogy, because the idea is that Jesus is the servant, and who really cares about the servant's genealogy anyway? Luke provides the genealogy, but in terms of Jesus' humanity, because Luke has a different purpose in mind. And so that's where they're at. Now, there are women in this genealogy. By the way, that itself is strange. Genealogies were patrilineal, and so you have women in the genealogy, and that should strike us. That should really call our attention to it. Let's deal with the first woman. That's in verse 3. Judah begat Perez and Zara by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Now what I want you to see here is there's a woman in the genealogy here in the verse, Tamar. And that's really the first woman that we're going to end up dealing with. Who was Tamar? A very long and interesting story. As you start to get into Joseph's story, there's this departure story in Genesis related to Tamar and Judah. And I could take some time and go through that, but we've got 4 women to cover. So I'm not going to spend forever. Here's what you do need to know. Tamar was an Abdulite, and that puts her in the sort of Canaanite category. She was the original wife of Judah's firstborn son. And if you look at Judah's genealogy, you end up seeing some things there. What's important to understand is that she wasn't a nice Jewish girl from the tribes of Jacob. By the way, that's interesting because, again, the tribal lineage then has to pass through the man. Here's good proof that the rabbis are not correct in assuming that the mother determines Jewishness alone, which is halakha now. I would argue that the scriptures don't back that up. I'm not going to argue about matrilineal Jewishness. What I am going to say is the idea that matrilineal only doesn't work. She's not a Jewish woman. She's a Abdulite. She's a Canaanite woman. By the way, in terms of tribal lineage and Jewishness, if you go to Leviticus 24, 10 and 11, you're going to see something else that Arnold Fruchtenbaum points out in his Israelology. Leviticus 24, 10 and 11 reads, "Now the son of an Israelite woman," the son of an Israelite woman, so the mother is an Israelite, whose father was an Egyptian. Oh, where did he come from? He left Egypt with the children of Israel, and there were many Egyptians that ended up doing that. Went out among the children of Israel, and this Israelite woman's son. Why doesn't it say this Jewish man? Because the Jewishness wasn't reckoned through the mother. And a man of Israel, which distinguishes the Jewish man from the son of the Israelite woman, fought each other in the camp, and the Israelite woman's son blasphemed, and blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed, and so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was, and I have it in phonetics here, Shelomet, the daughter of Divri of the tribe of Dan. Now what I want you to see here is it's perfectly acceptable for Tamar not to be Jewish and for Jesus still to be a son of Abraham and connected to the Jewish people because the Jewishness was reckoned patrilineally. Now, am I arguing that the offspring or folks that have a Jewish grandmother aren't Jewish? I'm not making that argument. I'm making the argument that the rabbis cannot uphold matrilineal only Jewishness, and that Jesus' genealogy does not disqualify him by having this woman in it. In fact, we're going to see it's very important that he has this woman there. So someone's going to say to me, well, wait a minute, when I turn to the New Testament, what do I do with Timothy? Acts 15 said that non-Jewish converts to Jesus did not need to undergo circumcision. They did not need to physically identify with the Jewish people. So Paul ends up not going through this surgical procedure with Titus, for he was a Greek, but he does go through this with Timothy. And Paul was very, very, very unmovable that this requirement for identification with Israel should not be imposed. And by the way, with it, the law of Moses in all its forms should not be imposed on non-Jewish believers in Jesus. That's really what Acts 15 is about. It's more than just circumcision. It's the law of Moses. And the idea is that all the forms of the law of Moses and the Hebrew calendar is not imposable on Gentiles. It doesn't mean that moral things from the Torah didn't carry over. It doesn't mean that things from the Torah didn't carry over. But the forms of the law of Moses that were given to Israel and the civil laws given to Israel were not going to go ahead and be imposed. So what do we do with Timothy? Well, Timothy was the son of a Greek man. And he was yet uncircumcised. However, Paul decided to take Timothy with him on his second journey and had him circumcised. We find that in Acts 16:3, Paul wanted to have him go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in the region, for they all knew his father was Greek. Why would that make a difference? Because who does Timothy identify with? Which people group is Timothy? Naturally, it would be normal to assume that Timothy was Greek because his father was Greek. Paul wants to make it very clear that in faith and in ethnic identity, Timothy identifies with the Jewish people, and so he has him circumcised because all the Jewish people would not necessarily have assumed that. In Titus's case, Paul does not do that, which is a very important point. Now, we talked about Tamar. Jesus is not disqualified in his lineage, quite the contrary. In fact, David is of the tribe of Judah. We talked about her being a widow. Tamar is a strange case. Tamar is actually the wife of the firstborn of Judah's sons. And ends up dying. Now, there was something called Levirate marriage. Don't try this at home. But if a man died, his brother then took his wife, and then they had children. The children were reckoned in such a way as to preserve the brother's line. This was to prevent tribal lines from being destroyed. And so that was the purpose of this. And so Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife, marry her, and raise up an heir to your brother. But Onan, now this is the background of the book of Ruth too, with Boaz and the kinsman redeemer and some of this whole material, ties into Ruth. Onan knew that the heir would not be his. Why? Because it would be reckoned to his brother's line. And so it came to pass, he went into his brother's wife. However, he practices an ancient form of birth control, which I don't need to talk about with a mixed audience, and ends up not doing his duty because he doesn't want to go ahead and not have the inheritance pass only into his line, lest he should give an heir to his brother. Check out Genesis 38, 8 and 9. So Tamar is a Canaanite who marries Judah's firstborn son and doesn't have any children, and then the brother is supposed to raise up a line for her, but he decides not to go ahead and fulfill that duty, and God gets angry and he dies. And Judah says that every time, he's thinking in the back of his head, every time I give a son to this woman, they end up dying, and this is not good, and so I'm going to leave her as is, except that he promises his next son to her. But at that time, he's a little young, and so she's kind of stuck waiting around. And by the way, Judah doesn't fulfill that promise, so she takes matters into her own hands. It's one of the strange Bible stories. You say, why is it there? Because it's following or explaining something about Judah's line that's going to be important later on. So when you read Tamar, you go, why is this here? Because it's a part of the story, and now here we are in Matthew referring back to the same strange section of Scripture, and because it's part of a bigger story. These strange, unexplainable stories not only have a moral lesson or tie into principles and tell us more about God, but they also fit within the larger context of the great story. So I have a family line here, but you can't see that. Tamar decides to go ahead and take matters into her hands, so she dresses up as a harlot. It came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, now she dressed up as a harlot. Judah, now see, this isn't so cool. Judah ended up staying the night and partaking of the services of what he thought was a call girl. And 3 months later, something happened. Judah was with her, and we can see that he was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot, and she is with child by harlotry. Now Judah then gets really angry, and he says, bring her out and let her be burned. A really nasty way to go about getting rid of somebody. And she was brought out, and she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whom these belong, I am with child. Now she had taken some things as surety from Judah. Down payment, you're supposed to pay me for the evening, right? You think there's a deal here, and I'm providing a service. I'm going to hold these. When he comes back, she's gone, but she's got his items. And so now she sends and she says, I'm pregnant by the guy who owns these things. A signet, a cord, and a staff. Now Judah recognizes these things, and he says, oh yeah. She says, please determine who these are. I mean, this is like a given. Judah acknowledged them, and he says, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son, and he never knew her again. And so now Judah has had to fulfill the kind of the promise in a backhanded sort of way to raise up a line for her. Now remember, there's no Social Security and there's no widow stuff. A woman was very dependent in that day and age upon her male heirs. By the way, that's some of the firstborn son getting a double portion is because he had to take care of mom and the brothers and sisters. And so now she is taken care of. Judah never ever spends any intimate time with her again. But that ended up being part of everything. And so that brings us to this first part here. Now, these aren't the only Gentile women. But this is like part one. We're going to see the other Gentile women and draw the conclusions. But we're going to stop right here now. I'm doing these messages in two parts, part one and part two. So although you'll see them separate, we'll say for part one of this message, how many Gentile women does it take to make a Messiah? I am signing off and wishing you shalom, and hopefully you will enjoy the background and the rest of this message. Please see us at www.zionsbanner.org for other material, and you can also see our Facebook page, which is Zion's Banner, with posts as to what we're doing, little camera shots, links to blogs and other things. We hope that you'll tune in to us, that you'll visit the website, and that you'll follow along. And we hope to have much more material and be continuing to expand our outreaches as we partner with individuals called, and hopefully you're one of them, to partner with us as we partner with God to make much of Messiah through God's big story.